Welcome to Search the Scriptures. Today we are going to combine three different studies, Study 10, Study 11, and Study 12 in John's Gospel. And this study will cover chapter 5, verse 30 through chapter 6 and verse number 40. So we're going to cover a lot of material today, but what we're going to cover centers around a couple of different things, centers around water and centers around bread. And I think you'll see this as we go along in the study today. When we begin with 5 verse 30, which comes from study number 10, there's a passage here where Jesus talks about who testifies of him. He says that John the Baptist testified about him, Moses testified about him, people were talking about him, and the Father was talking about him. The Lord was thrilled that John the Baptist had spoken of him and Moses had spoken about him, and more thrilled than anything, and what really mattered, and the only thing that mattered, was what the Father had to say about him. As to what the people were saying about him, that really wasn't very important at all. And that's what is brought out here in chapter number 5, verse 30 through the end of the chapter in verse number 47. What the Lord is concerned about is what the Father says about him. And that's what we need to be concerned about as believers. Not what people say. People will say all sorts of things. People won't understand what is really going on. Even people that sometimes study the Scriptures, they may not get what God is really trying to say. As many of the Jews did not understand what Moses was saying, did not understand what John the Baptist was saying. What really matters is what the Father has to say about us, and that's what we need to be the most concerned with. Going on to into the next chapter, chapter number 6, we have this story of the feeding of the 5,000. Story that we all love. If you ever spending time in a vacation Bible school or in Sunday school, you undoubtedly have heard this story. And Jesus poses an interesting question here as he's gathered on this hillside, this grassy hillside with thousands of people there listening to him, following him because of the miracles that he had began to perform. People began to follow after him and seek him and want to be there when he performed a miracle. They didn't want to miss anything. And when he's there and he sees the great crowd, he says to Philip in verse number 5, "Where are we going to buy bread for all these people to eat?" So he poses a question that causes an impossibility. It was impossible to feed all of these people. The disciples respond by saying it would take 8 months' worth of wages to feed this people. This is impossible. We can't possibly do this. And then Jesus says, I tell you what, I want you to set these people down in groups of 50 on the ground. So they distribute these people there on the ground, and they bring, it says here, the size of the lunch in verse number 8. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Jesus says, just have everybody sit down. So he has 5,000 people there set down. And as they sit down, it says that Jesus breaks the bread, he gives thanks, and he distributes to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. And it said they had plenty to eat. And when they had had their fill, he tells the disciples in the 12th verse, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. I find that it's interesting here that even though there's a miracle that's going to take place, the Lord brings some organization and some preparation to the miracle. Have the people sit down. Have them sit down in groups. He even provides take-home boxes for the disciples. Just so happens that there are 12 basketfuls left over. So each disciple has their take-home box to take home and to eat for lunch or breakfast that next morning as a reminder that God did provide. But he also provided a way and an organization. If we want God to do miracles in our lives, we can't live haphazard lives. We have to live lives that are organized around Him and His Word and obedience to Him. And as we are obedient to Him, He will give us questions that bring about impossibilities. But He'll never bring about an impossibility in our lives that He can't take care of. And I love how He took care of the situation in this passage. Now, immediately after this, something interesting happens. The disciples set out in a boat and they row for about 3.5 miles. And then Jesus comes to them walking on the water. Now, in John's Gospel, we don't have the account of Peter meeting Him halfway, so to speak, and going out on the water to greet Him. We merely have Jesus walking on the water in this portion of Scripture. And when He gets there, He tells them, it is I, in verse 20, don't be afraid. And then they were willing to take Him into the boat. Beforehand, they weren't willing to take this into the boat. They didn't know what it was. Some sort of ghost or something walking on the water. After all, it's not normal to see somebody walking on the water when you're about 3.5 miles out. But they invite Jesus into the boat. I like how this story is placed right here with Jesus having command over the water and Him having command over the bread and the fish. It shows us and kind of reflects back to the woman at the well when Jesus says, I am the living water. And now we're going to have Him talk about, right after this story, about Him being the bread of life. So we have two things, bread and water, being put in close proximity to one another in John's Gospel. Because bread and water, you see, you had to have every day. You could not possibly go without it. And you had to internalize this bread and this water if you were going to live. Now, Jesus criticizes some people here. They see that He had left. They didn't know He had left. They saw a boat there and only one boat left, but Jesus wasn't on it, and they didn't know where Jesus was. So they began after a time to search after Him, and they found Him and His disciples on the other side of the lake. But it says here in verse number 26 of chapter 6 of John's Gospel, Jesus answered, I tell you the truth, you are looking for me, not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and you had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On Him God the Father has placed His seal of approval. Now, earlier with the royal official whose son was sick, Jesus was a little bit critical of him because how are you going to believe? You're not going to believe unless you see miracles happen. And now He's criticizing here because you're not following me because of miracles, you're following me because of bread. So things have kind of actually deteriorated because of the miracles that Jesus has performed. So it's one thing if you seek after me because of the miracles that I can do and have done for other people, but now it's another thing. You're becoming even more selfish because it's about you now. It's about bread. It's about water. Just like the woman on the well. Well, give me this water so I don't have to come here anymore. In other words, people were wanting to seek after Jesus for what was in it for them, and really so that they could now enjoy a life of ease and luxury and prosperity. So they didn't have to go get water anymore. They didn't have to go get food anymore, which is what a great deal of their life centered around. And now they could sit back and pursue those things that were important to them. And Jesus tells them, you've really got it all wrong. And they ask Him then in verse 28, what must we do to do the works that God requires? And really, I think they just wanted to do just what He required, and they didn't want to go beyond that. But listen to what Jesus says in response in verse 29 of John 6. Jesus answered, the work of God is this, to believe in the one He has sent. To believe in the one that He has sent. Now we're going to see this belief isn't static. This belief isn't just that you sit around and you just believe. This belief requires action. It requires doing some things. And they respond to this by saying to him, well, we need some sort of miracle. We need to know somehow. And they go back to the bread thing again, thinking about themselves again. And just as an example, let's just take an example of maybe a miracle you could do. Moses, when he was in the desert, manna fell down from heaven. Maybe you could do a miracle on that order. Jesus responds this way in verse 32. I tell you the truth. It's not Moses who has given you bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. Verse 33. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. And after he says this, they say to him in the 34th verse, Sir, from now on give us this bread. The same thing the woman at the well said. From now on give me this water so I don't have to come and draw anymore. Sir, from now on give us this bread. And in verse 35, Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will never go hungry, and he who believes in me will never be thirsty. So you have him bringing the water back into play here. You need me, he said. You need me every day. And just as it would require work to go to the well to draw water, just as it would require work even with manna, when manna was coming from heaven to pick it up, or as it requires work to knead the dough and to bake the bread, as that requires work, it will require work to follow Jesus. This work of belief is not something you do once. You don't drink water once. You don't eat bread once. It's something you do every day. It's a work that you do daily, that you take in, that you internalize to keep you going. That's what Search the Scriptures is. It's that work of God to get the bread of life and the living water inside of us each and every day. That's why we study the Word like this together. I want to conclude here with verse number 41, even though it's not a part of study 10, 11, and 12. Verse 41 says this, At this the Jews began to grumble about him because he said, I am the bread of life that came down from heaven. Why do we grumble when it comes to listening to Jesus? When it comes to doing what Jesus says? I think we grumble because we want it easy. We just want God just providing, doing whatever it is we need each and every day. When Jesus says this, what you need to do every day is to seek after me with all your heart, to follow me with everything that is within you. See, following Jesus, this bread of life, is not following a trail of breadcrumbs and just God providing for us everywhere that we want to go, and just picking up the meat and the bread off the road and the water off the road, and Him just handing us a cup and everything just being glorious and wonderful and okay. Following after Jesus is to follow that living water, that bread of life, no matter where it takes us. It may take us through a desert. It may take us through a forest. It may take us beside still waters. It may take us through a valley of the shadow of death. It may take us through a valley, or it may take us up onto the mountaintop. But we need to follow Him daily, depend upon Him daily, wherever He takes us. Sometimes it'll be fun and glorious and wonderful and relaxing. And other times it'll mean work and sweat and tears. But whatever it means, very best thing that we can do, the thing that will keep us going through all eternity, is focusing on Him, trusting in Him, believing in Him, knowing that He won't ask us to do anything that He cannot get us through. It was impossible to feed 5,000 people, but He is God, the God of the impossible. It's impossible to walk on water, but He walked on it. What are you facing today that you think is impossible? I'm telling you right now, nothing is impossible with God. Search after Him daily with everything that is within you. I hope this study's been a blessing to you today, and may God richly bless the rest of your day.